Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 47 of B-Road Ballers, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of hot hatches, some older, some newer, some with more or less power, and some which are significantly larger or smaller than others. And in this particular pick we're featuring a vehicle which is one of the slightly smaller hot hatches. It's not necessarily tiny, but it's certainly not as big as, say, a Focus or a Megane. And the car is the Fiat Punto HGT Abarth, and this particular car is interesting. It's not an obvious choice of hot hatch, it's kind of a sleeper. It is after all a hot hatch, so it can only be a sleeper by so much, but the spec that it has is very interesting. It doesn't necessarily have the most power or the most torque or even necessarily the lowest weight, but it does have a reasonably good all-round selection of specs to work with. And of course we have featured this car on the channel before in the Dark series, so we may well touch on a couple of the points that we did then as well. Now, this car has a 1.7 litre turbo engine, it's front-wheel drive, and fully tuned it puts out 321 horsepower. Now straight off the bat, that's not bad at all for a 1.7 litre engine. Now these days, with more modern hot hatches that are on the game, you can tune engines up to a similar kind of power from a similar kind of size engine, and so we kind of take that for granted. But you have to remember that this car is from the year 2000, and although that doesn't seem that long ago, technology in tiny engines, especially tiny performance engines, really has come along a long way. So to say that it has that much power is actually quite impressive. As far as torque, it's also quite a torquey engine. 237 foot-pounds is perfectly respectable, and it is reasonably light. Not as light as some others, but for its size, it's pretty good. 925 kilos puts it on par with an Audi R10 Le Mans prototype. That's certainly not bad. As far as horsepower per tonne, it puts out 347, which is pretty decent to say the least, and the PP is perhaps a tiny bit too high, but justifiable to some degree at 482. I can understand why it's that high, because it does have a good spec, but at the same time I wouldn't necessarily recommend racing it at that level. Now as far as price, perhaps surprisingly for a smaller hot hatch, for a slightly older one, and especially for a Fiat, it does cost a little bit more than you might expect. 30 grand is a reasonably chunky price for a small, essentially borderline super mini version of a hot hatch. A city runabout with a bit more power than usual. That's essentially what this car is. Overall, 30 grand isn't breaking the bank, but it's probably about twice the price that I would have expected a car like this to be. It's still not bad though, the value is certainly good, so the question is, what is it better than? What is it necessarily not as good as? And is it worth buying? Does it have genuine uses? If so, when is best to use it, if at all? Well, as a track car on its own, which is a good place to start, it's very good. It quickly gives you a good impression of the car, it's fun to drive. It doesn't necessarily have the best handling of a front-wheel drive chassis, but again, it is a slightly older hot hatch, so that's not too surprising. Plus you have to remember that although this is technically a hot hatch, it's nowhere near as extreme with its performance in its real form, untuned, as many other cars in this series. It's not designed, for instance, to be powered by a 300 horsepower engine like something like a Ford Focus RS is. It's just not that kind of car. So to some degree, you have to recognise how well, or indeed how badly, a car does when it's upgraded, because oftentimes, especially in a production class vehicle, they're really not designed to have that kind of power put through their wheels. So if a car can deal with that at all, it's actually a really impressive thing. So the fact that some can deal with that so well and become brilliant cars really is a testament to how well engineered they are. In the game, of course, which isn't completely realistic, but is still an interesting look on how that car deals with being upgraded. Now this car doesn't deal with having an increase in power and performance as competently as some others. It certainly does have good handling, strong acceleration, good all-round performance, and it can give you decent lap times. But it doesn't necessarily feel comfortable with 321 horsepower. That is a lot of power to put through a small car's chassis, especially a front-wheel drive one, and it doesn't have much weight to ground those tyres either. So it is a little bit more inclined than some, especially some of the larger ones, to wheel spin at that power level. Is it rampant and uncontrollable? Certainly not. It's a very good handling car overall, but it is a Fiat at the end of the day, and although Fiats aren't bad cars, they're getting better and better as far as performance, it's still not an RS, it's not a GTI, it's not any number of these big league names that you would expect to be able to have that kind of power and just take it in their stride. So although it is by definition a fast car fully tuned, I think everyone would expect it to be with 321 horsepower, at the same time I wouldn't really recommend tuning it to that level. It can cope with it, but it just doesn't feel quite like everything's working together perfectly. And this is by no means the only car that feels that way, there are certainly others as well. So I would recommend, if you are looking to buy this car, which I would recommend it typically for people who are looking for something different, this isn't really the kind of hot hatch that I'd recommend getting instead of anything else, more as well as. So for instance, if you fancy trying something new, or having an alternative to maybe your number one choice of hot hatch, then this is an interesting car, and it is a dependable one for certain scenarios of racing. But overall, that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.